In 1851, a U.S. Army captain wrote in his personal diary, "We have been fighting ghosts. The Indians appear from nowhere, strike with terrifying precision, and vanish into the mountains as if the very earth swallows them whole. 3 of my best scouts have deserted, claiming they've seen warriors walking through solid rock. I am beginning to question my own sanity." That diary was discovered in a San Francisco antique shop in 1987. The captain's name was scratched out. His regiment's records were mysteriously destroyed in a fire that consumed only that specific filing cabinet. And the ghosts he described? They were part of a coordinated indigenous resistance movement, so sophisticated, so secretive, that the United States government spent over a century trying to erase every trace of its existence. This is the story they never wanted you to know. The year 1848 didn't just bring gold to California, it brought apocalypse to its original inhabitants. When James Marshall spotted those glittering flakes at Sutter Mill on January 24, 1848, he unknowingly set into motion the greatest demographic catastrophe in North American history. Within 18 months, over 100,000 gold seekers flooded into California. Within a decade, the indigenous population of California, estimated at 150,000 to 300,000 people, would be reduced to fewer than 30,000. But here's what the history books don't tell you. They didn't go quietly. The conventional narrative portrays California's native peoples as passive victims, overwhelmed by disease and superior firepower, unable to mount meaningful resistance. This narrative is a lie, a carefully constructed lie that served the interests of the state government, mining corporations, and federal authorities who had every reason to downplay the scope and sophistication of indigenous resistance. The truth is far more compelling. Across the Sierra Nevada, the Coast Ranges, and the vast inland valleys, indigenous communities organized one of the most remarkable resistance movements in American history. They formed unprecedented alliances across tribal boundaries. They developed guerrilla tactics that would later be studied by military strategists, and they nearly succeeded in halting the gold rush altogether. In the winter of 1850-1851, something extraordinary happened in the Sierra Nevada foothills east of what is now Fresno. The Ahwahneechee, Chowchilla, and several other Miwok-speaking bands did something that should have been impossible according to the racial theories of the time. They outmaneuvered, outfought, and humiliated the California State Militia. The conflict began, as most conflicts do, with theft. Gold miners had established camps along the tributaries of the Merced and Mariposa rivers, directly in the heart of Miwok territory. They didn't just take the gold, they took everything. They burned villages for sport. They murdered indigenous people with impunity. California law at the time specifically prohibited Native Americans from testifying against white citizens in court. They kidnapped children to sell as slaves, a legal and profitable enterprise in California until 1863. And they systematically destroyed the food sources that indigenous communities had cultivated for millennia. Chief Tenaya of the Ahwahneechee initially counseled peace. He remembered the Spanish missions, the Mexican rancheros, the steady encroachment of outsiders over his lifetime. He had seen what happened to tribes that fought. But by December 1850, his people faced a choice between starvation and resistance. They chose resistance. What followed shocked everyone. On December 17, 1850, Ahwahneechee warriors attacked a trading post run by James Savage, killing 3 employees and destroying thousands of dollars worth of supplies. Over the next 2 weeks, coordinated attacks struck mining camps across a 50-mile front. Cabins were burned, equipment was destroyed, and the miners, many of them hardened veterans of the Mexican-American War, fled in terror. The attacks displayed a level of tactical sophistication that the U.S. military had never encountered from indigenous forces
west of the Mississippi. The warriors struck at night, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to approach undetected. They targeted supply lines and communication routes. They never engaged in pitched battles where American firepower would have been decisive, and they coordinated their movements across vast distances with a precision that suggested either supernatural abilities or a communication system that American intelligence never managed to understand. Governor John McDougall responded by authorizing the formation of the Mariposa Battalion, a volunteer militia of 200 men led by James Savage himself, a man who had lived among the Miwok peoples for years, spoke their languages, and had married at least 5 indigenous women. Savage was supposed to be the Americans' secret weapon. He knew the culture, he knew the terrain, he knew the leaders personally. What he didn't know was that Tenaya and his allies had been preparing for this moment for years. The campaign that followed became a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. When the Mariposa Battalion marched into the mountains in March 1851, they expected a quick victory. They found empty villages, vanished supplies, and an enemy that seemed to melt into the landscape like morning mist. For 3 months, the battalion chased shadows. They burned abandoned rancherias. They captured elderly people and children too weak to flee. They congratulated themselves on their victories, but they never managed to engage the main body of warriors in battle. Meanwhile, the attacks continued. On April 3, 1851, a patrol of 12 militiamen was found dead in a ravine near the South Fork of the Merced River. They had been killed so quietly that a relief party passing within 200 yards heard nothing. Their weapons were missing, their supplies were gone, and someone had arranged their bodies in a precise circle, feet pointing inward, in a formation that no one could explain. 3 days later, a miner named Thomas Howard stumbled into Savage's camp, half mad with terror, claiming he had witnessed something impossible. He said that warriors had walked out of a waterfall, literally emerged from the falling water itself, ambushed his companions, and then retreated back into the cascade before anyone could return fire. Howard was dismissed as a lunatic, but his account was quietly filed in military records that wouldn't be declassified until 1978. The warrior's ability to appear and disappear seemed almost supernatural, but the explanation was far more remarkable than magic. The Ahwahneechee knew every cave, every hidden trail, every secret passage in a landscape they had inhabited for thousands of years. They had food caches hidden throughout the mountains. They had observation posts on every major approach, and they had developed a communication system using fire, smoke, mirrors, and human runners that could transmit complex messages across 50 miles in less than 2 hours. Most impressively, they had formed alliances that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. Tenaya had spent years building relationships with bands throughout the southern Sierra Nevada. The Chowchilla, the Nuchu, the Putayensi, groups that had historically competed for resources, now shared intelligence, coordinated movements, and pooled their warriors for joint operations. This alliance represented something unprecedented in California indigenous history, and its architects understood that their survival depended on complete secrecy. They established a council that met at a location so well hidden that its existence wouldn't be confirmed until archaeological excavations in the 1970s uncovered what appeared to be a ceremonial site showing evidence of multi-tribal gatherings during precisely this period.
The Mariposa Battalion's campaign is remembered today primarily for one thing: the discovery of Yosemite Valley. On March 27, 1851, the battalion became the first group of white Americans to enter what the Ahwahneechee called Ahwahnee, a valley of such stunning beauty that even the battle-hardened militiamen were momentarily struck speechless. Waterfalls cascaded thousands of feet down sheer granite cliffs. Ancient sequoias towered over meadows carpeted with wildflowers, and the whole scene was framed by rock formations so massive and dramatic that they seemed to belong to another world. Dr. Lafayette Bunnell, the battalion surgeon,
would later write that he felt a peculiar exalted sensation upon first seeing the valley, as if I stood in the presence of something greater than anything I had ever encountered. This moment is typically portrayed as a triumph of American exploration, the courageous militia pushing into unknown territory and revealing a natural wonder to the world. But that narrative requires erasing something important. The valley wasn't unknown, it was home. The Ahwahneechee had lived in Yosemite for thousands of years. They had created sophisticated systems for managing the valley's resources, including controlled burns that maintained the meadows and oak groves. They had established complex settlements with permanent structures. They had developed a rich cultural tradition centered on this specific landscape. And when the battalion arrived, they found the valley empty, not abandoned, emptied. The Ahwahneechee had removed everything of value, destroyed what they couldn't carry, and vanished into the surrounding wilderness with such thoroughness that the Americans found almost no trace of human habitation. This wasn't a retreat, it was a strategic relocation. Tenaya understood that the valley, however beloved, was indefensible against an enemy with rifles and artillery. By abandoning it, he denied the Americans their objective, while preserving his people's ability to continue the fight. Over the next 2 years, the Ahwahneechee conducted what can only be described as a brilliant guerrilla campaign. They raided supply trains, they ambushed patrols, they made the mining district so dangerous that many prospectors simply left. And they did all this while constantly moving, never allowing the Americans to fix their position or bring superior numbers to bear. The Mariposa War wasn't an isolated incident. It was the most visible manifestation of a resistance movement that extended throughout California and into neighboring territories. In the north, the Modoc people were preparing for what would eventually become the most costly Indian war in American history. Though the Modoc War wouldn't reach its climax until 1872 to 73, the planning and alliance building began in the early 1850s, directly influenced by news of the Southern resistance. Captain Jack, Kintpwash in his own language, was a young man during the Mariposa War, and he reportedly met with messengers from the Southern tribes who shared intelligence about American tactics and weaknesses. The sophisticated defensive strategy he would later employ at the lava beds, where 53 Modoc warriors held off over 1,000 U.S. Army troops for months, showed clear evidence of lessons learned from the earlier resistance. In the coastal mountains, the Pomo people conducted their own campaign of resistance that rarely appears in history books. Between 1850 and 1860, Pomo warriors attacked numerous ranches and settlements in the Clear Lake region, targeting those who had participated in massacres of their people. These weren't random acts of violence. They were carefully planned operations designed to punish specific individuals and deter future atrocities. The most significant of these actions came in response to the Bloody Island Massacre of May 1850, when U.S. Army troops under Lieutenant Nathaniel Lyon, later a Union general in the Civil War, killed between 60 and 200 Pomo people on an island in Clear Lake. The victims were mostly women, children, and elderly people who had been unable to flee. Many were killed while sleeping. The survivors vowed revenge, and over the next decade, several of the soldiers who had participated in the massacre died under mysterious circumstances. At least 2 were found dead with no apparent cause. 3 others disappeared in the wilderness and were never seen again. Official records attributed these deaths to accidents and natural causes, but Pomo oral traditions tell a different story, one of deliberate, patient justice.
The Modoc War of 1872 to 1873 remains the most dramatic example of indigenous resistance in the West, and its full story has never been properly told. It began with a desperate escape. In November 1872, approximately 180 Modoc people, including only 53 fighting warriors, fled the Klamath Reservation in southern Oregon and returned to their homeland near Tule Lake in northern California. They knew the U.S. Army would come for them. They prepared accordingly. What followed
was the most humiliating defeat the U.S. Army suffered in the Indian Wars. The Modocs took refuge in an area known as the lava beds, a maze of volcanic caves, tunnels, and rock formations covering approximately 12 square miles. Captain Jack and his warriors knew every feature of this landscape. They had cached food and water supplies in hidden locations. They had established defensive positions that commanded every approach, and they had developed tactics perfectly suited to the terrain. On Good Friday, April 11, 1873, Captain Jack made the decision that would ultimately destroy the Modoc resistance and guarantee his place in history as a tragic figure. Under pressure from younger warriors who had lost patience with negotiations, Captain Jack agreed to a plan to assassinate the U.S. peace commissioners during a scheduled meeting. General Edward Canby and Reverend Eleazar Thomas were killed. 2 other commissioners were wounded, and the American public's reaction guaranteed that there would be no mercy for the Modocs. The assassination is often portrayed as an act of desperation or even treachery, but the full context reveals something more complex. The Modocs had good reason to distrust American promises. Previous peace treaties had resulted in their removal to the Klamath Reservation, where they had been treated as second-class residents, denied promised supplies, and subjected to harassment by Klamath people, who historically had been their enemies. They had watched as other tribes signed treaties that were then ignored or modified by Congress. They knew that peace on American terms meant the destruction of everything they valued. General Canby himself had a complicated history with indigenous peoples. During the Civil War, he had suppressed the Navajo Long Walk, forcibly relocating thousands of Navajo people under brutal conditions. The Modocs knew this history. When they looked at Canby, they didn't see a neutral negotiator. They saw the architect of their people's future suffering. None of this excuses murder, but it contextualizes it in ways that the simplified narrative, treacherous savages attack peaceful commissioners, cannot. The aftermath was predictably brutal. With public opinion demanding blood, the Army abandoned all restraint. The Modocs were hunted through the lava beds and beyond. Those who were captured faced execution or deportation. Captain Jack and 3 other leaders were hanged at Fort Klamath on October 3, 1873. Their bodies were initially buried, then secretly exhumed and shipped to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C., where Captain Jack's skull was studied by researchers convinced that its shape could explain the criminal tendencies of the Modoc people. The skull remained in the Smithsonian's collection until 1984, when it was finally returned to the Modoc people for proper burial. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of indigenous resistance in the West was its coordination, and that coordination has left behind one of the most intriguing historical mysteries. Throughout the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s, American military officers repeatedly noted evidence of communication between widely separated indigenous groups. Information seemed to travel faster than should have been possible. Warnings about American movements reached distant villages before the Army's own messengers, and strategic decisions in one conflict often seemed to reflect lessons learned from battles fought hundreds of miles away. Colonel George Wright, commanding U.S. forces in the Pacific Northwest during the 1850s, wrote to his superiors that the hostiles possess some means of communication that we do not understand. I have seen orders transmitted across distances of 200 miles in less than 48 hours through territory that would require a horseman a week to traverse. How was this possible? Some historians have dismissed such claims as paranoid exaggeration. Others have attributed them to the efficiency of runners and smoke signals, but the evidence suggests something more sophisticated. In 1962, anthropologist George E. Harrington conducted interviews with elderly members of several Northern California tribes as part of an oral history project. Several of these interviewees, speaking on condition of anonymity, described what they called the Long Trail, a network of hidden paths, cache sites, and relay points that allowed messengers to travel from the Oregon border to the southern Sierra Nevada without ever being seen by outsiders. According to these accounts, the Long Trail predated European contact, originally serving as a trade and ceremonial route connecting distant peoples. But during the crisis of the mid-19th century, it was transformed into something new, an intelligence network. Young people who demonstrated exceptional speed and endurance were trained as specialized messengers. They learned not only the routes, but also elaborate coding systems that allowed them to carry messages that couldn't be understood if intercepted. They established emergency protocols that allowed the network to continue functioning even if individual links were compromised. Most remarkably, these messengers apparently carried more than information. They transported supplies, including weapons and ammunition acquired from sympathetic traders or taken in raids. They moved refugees from areas of active conflict to safer locations, and they facilitated meetings between leaders who officially had no contact with each other. If these accounts are accurate, and archaeological evidence increasingly supports them, then indigenous resistance in the West was far more organized than anyone has acknowledged. It wasn't a series of isolated rebellions, it was a coordinated resistance movement spanning thousands of miles. Part 9. The Unsolved Mysteries. No account of indigenous resistance in the American West would be complete without acknowledging what we don't know and what someone, at some point, clearly didn't want us to know. In 1891, the California State Archives suffered a fire that destroyed thousands of documents relating to the Indian Wars of the 1850s and 1860s. The fire was officially attributed to faulty wiring, but it occurred only 3 months after a state assemblyman requested access to sealed records from the Mariposa War. In 1923, a researcher named Catherine Cole traveled through the Sierra Nevada foothills collecting oral histories from elderly Miwok people. She compiled her findings into a manuscript that, according to her letters, contained revelations that will require a fundamental reassessment of California's history. Cole died in a traffic accident before the manuscript could be published. Her papers were seized by her family, who claimed she had burned the manuscript before her death, but her letters describe making multiple copies and sending them to colleagues for safekeeping. No copies have ever been found. In 1957, the Bureau of Indian Affairs quietly reclassified a collection of documents relating to intertribal communication networks in 19th-century California. The classification was ostensibly for national security reasons. In 1991, a FOIA request for these documents was denied on grounds that they could not be located. What secrets were these documents protecting? What truths were considered too dangerous to reveal? The most tantalizing mystery centers on an event that allegedly took place in early 1851 during the height of the Mariposa War. According to accounts that have circulated within Miwok communities for generations, representatives from at least a dozen tribes gathered at a secret location in the Sierra Nevada to discuss a coordinated campaign to drive all Americans from California. This wasn't merely a military conference. According to the oral traditions, it was a spiritual event, a ceremony calling upon powers that Western rationalism cannot accommodate. The participants reportedly included not only warriors and chiefs, but also spiritual leaders who had been preparing for this moment through years of ceremony and vision quest. What happened at this gathering? The oral traditions are deliberately vague. speaking in symbolic language that resists literal interpretation, but they consistently describe a decision, a choice between two paths. One path led to total war, an all-or-nothing campaign that would either drive out the invaders or result in the complete destruction of the peoples involved. The other path led to survival, strategic retreat, the preservation of cultural knowledge, the long wait for a better time. According to the traditions, they chose survival, not because they couldn't fight, they had proven they could, not because they had given up hope. The traditions explicitly speak of this as a temporary retreat, not a surrender. They chose survival because they understood something that American society of the time could not comprehend, that cultures, unlike individuals, can survive destruction if they are willing to go underground.
In 2019, the California State Legislature issued a formal apology for the state's role in the 19th century genocide of indigenous peoples. Governor Gavin Newsom acknowledged that California had paid bounties for the killing of Indians, including children, and facilitated the removal of children from their families. This apology was an important symbolic gesture, but it barely scratched the surface of what happened, or of what that history means for the present. The indigenous peoples of California didn't just resist militarily, they preserved their cultures through generations of oppression. They maintained their languages when speaking them was forbidden. They practiced their ceremonies in secret when doing so could result in imprisonment or death. They passed their knowledge from generation to generation through a darkness that lasted over a century, and they survived from this. Today, over 700,000 people in California identify as indigenous or partially indigenous. The tribes that were supposed to have vanished are still here. The Maidu, the Miwok, the Pomo, the Modoc, the dozens of other peoples who faced extermination, they're still fighting. Not with rifles and ambushes now, but with legal actions, political organizing, language revitalization programs, and the simple, powerful act of continuing to exist. The history of indigenous resistance in the American West isn't a closed chapter, it's a continuing story, and the mysteries that remain unsolved, the hidden communication networks, the secret gatherings, the strategic decisions that allowed these peoples to survive, aren't just historical curiosities, they're blueprints for resistance that may yet prove relevant. In 2016, when water protectors gathered at Standing Rock to oppose the Dakota Access Pipeline, they employed tactics that would have been familiar to Captain Jack or Tenaya. Decentralized organization, sophisticated communication, strategic use of terrain, and a willingness to sacrifice for principles that transcended individual survival. The resistance never ended. It adapted. It went underground when necessary. It waited. And it emerged when conditions changed. The true story involves secrets, deliberately kept, carefully guarded, passed down through generations. We may never know all of those secrets. Some were lost when the last speakers of certain languages died. Some were burned in fires that may not have been accidents. Some are still being kept, preserved for a future that hasn't arrived yet. But we know enough to understand that the history we've been taught is incomplete. We know enough to ask better questions, and we know enough to look at the landscapes of the American West, those stunning valleys, those dramatic mountains, those vast deserts, and see them not as empty wilderness awaiting discovery, but as homelands defended with courage, intelligence, and sacrifice. The next time you visit Yosemite Valley, look up at those granite cliffs and ask yourself, what stories are embedded in this stone? What whispers echo in these forests? What secrets do these waters carry as they cascade into the valley below? The land remembers what we have chosen to forget,
And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can almost hear it speaking. The ghosts are still here. They're just waiting for someone to acknowledge their names. For more stories like this, you want to know, comment below.